Welcome to Enemies from War to Wisdom. Why do we need enemies? From intimate relationships to politics, tribalism, and community, we cannot seem to stop dehumanizing each other. Chronic conflicts in our families, societies, and nations seem inevitable. In this podcast, we analyze human hostilities from the most mundane to the most sophisticated. We apply psychology, psychoanalysis, art, spirituality, and relational theory in conversation about belonging and otherness. Each program will reach for a fresh wisdom that shows us how to step back from creating enemies in our lives. I'm your host, Eleanor Johnson, a videographer and artist with Emma Troupe, an experimental theater group in New York City, and I am here with my co-host, Young-Eisendrath, who is a psychologist, Jungian analyst, author, and speaker. We approach our ideas each from our own worlds, but always from the spirit and teaching of Buddhism, of which we are lifelong practitioners. In today's podcast, we're going to be talking about what is power and what is vulnerability. How do Homo Sapiens get and control power? What do we mean by power, and how does it relate to influencing others or taking control? What is true power that can sustain us through our difficulties, and false power that leads only to fears and misgivings? In this podcast today, we're going to be contemplating power and vulnerability and how they function in our relationships, our aging, and our health. Welcome, Polly. Another big topic for us today.
Hi, Eleanor. Well, it's a much easier topic than some of the topics we've been talking about.
That's right. This is a piece of cake.
Yes, compared to speech and freedom of speech, power is easy to talk about. So I think
vulnerability.
And vulnerability.
Yes, and vulnerability, yes.
So let me talk with you first. Let me ask you, Eleanor, what do you think power is? Just think about power as a concept. What is power?
Well, when I think about power, I think of, right power versus wrong power. Power over power that can help us to become better human beings. Mm-hmm. Use power as a good engine. But I think
what is power? What is it? How do you get it?
Well, that's a complicated one, Polly. That's complex. That's very nuanced. How do you get it? I mean, either it's given to you or you earn it.
Well, what do you think it means? Does it mean control of others, or does it mean
power gives you control?
Control of what?
Whatever you're controlling.
Well,
I mean, I don't know how to simply talk about it. I mean, power can be a very, very good thing if used in the right way, and a very destructive thing if used in the wrong way.
Well, let's think about it from the past, because seems like it's easier when we once upon a time there was a king and a queen.
Right, and we think power over, or power that's misused, or that kind of thing.
I want to talk about power in a broad way.
Yeah.
And then I want to talk about it in relation to vulnerability.
Right.
So I've just looked up the Webster dictionary definition of power. So the very first definition is the ability to act or to produce an effect.
Right.
So to act or produce an effect gives you power. And then the capacity for being acted upon or undergoing an effect. So that's like power over you.
Right.
The second definition is the possession of control, authority, or influence over others.
Right.
And then physical might.
Right.
Is the third definition.
Right.
So all of those definitions I've certainly thought about. The power to produce an effect is an interesting one, because that definition puts it close to agency.
Uh-huh.
That you have the agency to do something. The agency aspect of power would mean that you're just empowered. You can do it directly.
That's what I was thinking of, empowerment.
Yeah.
The beneficial aspect of it, yes.
You feel like you have a confidence in what you're doing. Right. But I was thinking also that as soon as I read the definition of the power to produce an effect, I thought about the magician that I had seen in New York. I'm Darren Brown is his name.
Oh, right, yes.
Who is an illusionist.
Right.
So the effects that he produces are not straight out magic. They're not sleight of hand. But he can create an illusion so that he seems to know a lot of things that he couldn't possibly know, and you cannot tell how he's created that illusion. So he has in that way the power to produce an effect that you don't understand.
Exactly, yes.
And a lot of times that's what we actually think of as people's power. Like even a king or a queen, they had a lot of power only when there was an illusion. As soon as somebody undercut them, you recognize they're just regular people. They're not, magic people. So that sense of having power as particularly as a control over somebody else. I mean, I find that people want to, let me just get over here. In therapy, people ask a lot about how do you control other people? How do you, people will say like, well, how can I get my partner to do what I want? Or how can I get my child to do what I want? And so in a sense, they want power over these other people to bring about control. And actually, it's very hard for us to even do that with ourselves. I mean, if you say to yourself, like I said to myself today, well, I'm not going to eat any more chocolate candy today. Just today, I'm not going to eat chocolate candy. So then I go over to the kitchen, and it's the end of my lunch, and I'm hungry for a sweet, and I think, oh, I'll just eat a half a piece of chocolate. So, I didn't really have that control. I intended that, but at that moment I said, okay, I'll have the half a piece of chocolate. So that idea that we have control over anything, I like to get rid of, because we don't even have control over ourselves, much less other people. So sometimes people say, well, if we don't have control over other people, like I was talking to somebody in therapy, she says, so then how can I get him to do what I want him to do? Well, how about slavery? Slavery takes away somebody else's autonomy. So actually, to have true power over another adult, you have to take away their autonomy. And to have power over yourself, you have to exercise your autonomy. And autonomy is your ability to govern yourself. Or, if it's someone else's, it's someone else's autonomy, their ability to govern themselves. So that the sense of power is really kind of an illusion, but people think of it as not being an illusion. They think somebody else has got the power, or...
Yeah, it depends on what level you're talking at. I mean, you can develop internal powers that can help be more preventative in terms of people having power over you to the best of your ability. I mean, you can't do much when the government comes in and says, or the police, or, or you break a law or things like that.
But you were saying like internal power more like just taking control of like your mind or your diet or your speech or whatever like that.
And just, disciplining yourself. And again, having foundational beliefs that can help you to have your own agency.
So let's say then the good kind of power that we're both talking about is agency. Yeah, it's kind of like being able to do things. Yeah. You have then a power that allows you to make a plan and carry it out, or to bring a discipline into your life, or to set up some expectations and carry them out.
Or even have the internal power to not have expectations.
To not have expectations.
But when you mentioned the king and queen, the first thing that I thought of in terms of, power over, or, when you had the strength to revolt against, say, the king and queen, that was an empowerment. Or you could form another country, like when people came into America and formed democracy in relation to, say, the monarchs and things, when they were running from that kind of oppressive situation in the old world when they came to America. Right. We were talking earlier about, the beginning of our Constitution and all of that, and our democracy. Right. So, how we work in relation to when we face powerlessness.
Well, so, like, in relation to the king and the queen, when you revolt, that's called a revolution.
Right.
You actually recognize that they are not as powerful as you had thought they were.
Exactly.
You probably would say they're not as powerful as they think they are, but it's you who's attributing that effect to them. Right. So very often people think somebody else has power over them because they're attributing this agency or this effect to the other person. So, the kind of effect, unless, there are certainly people that have status and there are roles that we play,
Right.
So if somebody is your boss,
Right.
that person does have power.
That's right.
Over whatever the
Right.
role is.
Or a parent over a child.
Yes, a parent over a child. And so in those situations, there's real power over you. It's connected to the role that they have.
Yes.
But many times when people talk about power and empowerment, what they do is they attribute some kind of effect to another person and assume that person has this power. Like that they have the power to reject them, or they have the power to approve of them, or the power to endorse them, where all of those powers are attributed by the individual.
Yes.
who is actually feeling like that person has power over me. That person could reject me. So a lot of power is projected.
Right.
It's like an attribution to the other
Right.
person.
Or to avoid vulnerability. Avoid at all costs a sense of, just on a personal level, to avoid any sense of powerlessness.
So let's talk about
yeah.
vulnerability. Is vulnerability powerlessness, or is it something else?
Well, I mean, when you unpack, to use a popular phrase now, vulnerability, you find you go in and you mine the gold of vulnerability. Then it becomes a strength. Whereas most people are terrified of vulnerability.
Well, what do you mean by vulnerability?
Vulnerability is being able to be in, well, I'm going to just say, right relationship with your own emotional reality. Your feeling body. So vulnerability is when you're most raw, most vulnerable, most triggered. All of those things I see as vulnerability, and also in many ways it's kind of our society tries to keep us from being vulnerable.
Well, let's say, I think the way you're speaking is very much in the sort of popular culture, exactly. And sort of Brene Brown. And
yes, now
kind of
to be able to redeem vulnerability.
Right.
Whereas, but in other words, I think even in my training in my early years in the theater, and one of the things that was a no-no was, to show vulnerabiliety.
Not in acting.
Not in acting, that's a different thing, but in that whole thing of,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I think when you're talking about...
And acting, it becomes a source point. Yes.
Right. I think what you're talking about as vulnerability is expressing something where you're not defensive, where your defenses are down.
Right.
And so then you're expressing something without trying to protect yourself. Right. Is that what you mean kind of by vulnerability?
Because vulnerability makes you're on shaky ground. So it's harder when you're in vulnerability to kind of ground yourself in groundlessness, because there's a lot of fear. It's very, very charged.
Well, it probably depends on, again, the situation, because...
Right, of course, because it involves shame and all these other huge
there are
things.
many things that can be, when you start to express emotion
Right.
and you don't defend yourself,
Right.
There are many different emotions in the human heart.
Right,
and
exactly.
So it depends on the situation as to whether it looks vulnerable or whether it looks aggressive or whether it looks afraid. The typical, I think, experience of vulnerability is weakness, is you feel weak.
Or worthless. Or
not
good enough.
Not good enough,
Yeah.
or weak, or limited, or wrong, or like you
or
are...
I have a terrible affliction.
Yeah, like somehow you're disabled, I suppose,
right,
in that. So that experience of being weak or dependent or limited is the kind of thing that people think of as the opposite of power.
Right.
I think that in their vocabulary about themselves, they feel if they were empowered, they wouldn't be experiencing vulnerability. Right. One of the things that I believe, again, is a truth from watching people over time, is that as soon as you begin to become empowered or more like an agent in your own life, as soon as you say, I would like to do this, or this is something that I want to create, at that moment, you are more vulnerable than you've ever been in your experience because you stuck your neck out to say what you wanted. And so it doesn't feel safe when you stick out your neck.
Well, that's another piece, safety, in terms of, vulnerability. You don't feel safe.
Yeah, I mean, is by its nature, you feel weak or you feel undefended.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when people are changing and developing, and they're developing their own agency and their own creativity, and they want to then find their path in the world. So then they have to apply for a job or apply for a grant, or they have to go out and give their CV to a bunch of people. What they confront in that moment that they think is their empowerment because they just finished their training or they just finished their meditation retreat, what they find is they feel more vulnerable. And so it's confusing. They think, wow, I thought I was going to feel more powerful, but I actually feel more vulnerable. And this is the kind of issue that I think, again, a lot of women have a lot of confusion about. Because for some reason, we believe that if we have believed that if we moved out into the world with our desires, the world was going to go, how wonderful. But the world doesn't act like that. When you go out into the world with your desires, the world says, well, who are you? Or why would you want that? Why would anyone want that? And so that is usually one of the most vulnerable things. It's like I find women who have gone to extensive graduate school, or they have already had their children, or they've done a lot of things that have been challenging, but then they step out into the world to try to create their own thing. They're surprised at the feeling of vulnerability, which I think is part of...
Why do you think that is?
Why are they surprised?
Yeah.
Because I don't think they've experienced it previously.
Yeah.
I think they have felt protected in their development while they were going to graduate school, while they were having their kids or whatever.
They were protected.
They were in an environment where no one had to approve of them, or, I mean, yes, they had to perform.
It's like, do you think that also vulnerability really is rooted in direct experience? I mean, something happens to you and you discover your vulnerability. You learn about your vulnerability through direct experience, not through some concept you have. It's not a concept.
It's really an experience.
It's an experience.
You experience it when you get sick.
Right.
You experience it when you lose all your money.
Yes.
When you're in danger.
Yeah.
Or when you want to accomplish something and you want power.
Well, that's true.
Because you want to go out and influence others, or you want to get your project going, you want to bring your thing into the world.
Right.
And so you take that step off at the edge. Here I am with all of my stuff, right, and nobody applauds.
And rejection is a huge it creates a lot of vulnerability.
Well, yeah, when you haven't even been rejected yet.
Yes.
Yeah, I
mean, even if you think you can handle it.
Well, even if you just sent out your stuff,
right?
Yes. And nobody has written you back yet. I think more often it is like, you're in a group situation and you want to propose your project. And so you've written your proposal, you've checked it out, you think it's good, and then you go in and you say your proposal and you feel so vulnerable. And you have this thought like, why am I not more empowered? Here I am. I finished my degree. I did this and do that. Why don't I feel confident? Because actually, when you take a step into so-called power, often that's when you feel most vulnerable. And that happens again and again. It's like when you say, oh, I would like to marry you, or I would like to accomplish this. At those moments, when you seem like you are powerful or you're the agent, you feel this sense of, I need somebody else right now, which is that sense of your dependence on others, your weakness and your vulnerability, and which I really very much think is a part of ordinary experience. Whenever you're trying to create something,
right,
whenever you're trying to start a new relationship, that we should expect a feeling of vulnerability and not some feeling of empowerment, because nobody else can actually make you feel okay about sticking out your neck.
Right.
You have to yourself. And generally speaking, you don't feel okay. When you stick your neck out for a while, you're at risk at getting your head chopped off. Right. And so you do feel it.
Right.
You feel it, yeah.
Exactly.
So, that's a different vulnerability than the vulnerability maybe that Brene Brown is talking about.
Right.
Which
she was trying to give, again, a skill that will allow people to understand that, our problems can be our opportunities, and the way that we as Buddhists talk about, suffering, and that we can bring the cessation to suffering. But if you can't face suffering, I mean, one of the things that motivated me to be able to go into history and to place myself in history and to walk the concentration camps and to go into the heart where the Inquisition happened and the guillotine and all of these different things at ground zero in New York had to do with facing that within myself. I mean, that's the artist to me, it's my palette. I mean, I'm not saying this is for anybody else, but it was important to me to be able to test myself. And I didn't want to just be in concepts. I wanted to feel it. I needed to. And the awesome vulnerability. I mean, one of the greatest vulnerable moments in my life was when I walked the concentration camps, because I had to face it. But also the courage of bearing witness on that level was tremendous as well. I mean, there was a freedom and a joy in that sorrow.
So you felt in those moments, you felt the other people's suffering and their tragedies and their griefs and their pains and so on.
And my own vulnerability in terms of facing that, the courage required to face that, to really face that, to face that dark shadow within humanity. And to really, to feel it, So
maybe, when people take the step out into, let's say, the abyss of their own creativity, at that moment, maybe what they are feeling to some extent is the dark shadow of their creativity. You could say, when you've created something or you want to do something or you feel like you've got something to offer the world, at that moment, there comes the question usually like, well, what if you are an imposter? What if you don't know what you know? And so that the vulnerability that you feel may be the shadow of the power that you're wanting. And in a similar way, when you're in the shadow of great destruction that other humans have brought to humans, you feel the shadow of our human being, that we actually have had such difficulty not preserving people that we disagree with. We just want to kill them.
I just keep thinking of the Taoist line of, stop trouble before it starts.
Yeah, well...
In terms of, that aspect of humanity, the preventative, the facing, the feel, but it's not even facing, it's not intellectual, it's a feeling.
Well, that's certainly, compassion is the feeling with others suffering. And so there's a vulnerability in that. Yeah. And that's, again, that's a very different kind of thing.
It is. I think I am
than
looking
the
at it.
power and vulnerability thing that
right.
I think that our experience of vulnerability is really the experience when we're not defended. And maybe there's certainly when we're grieving, we experience that. When we're sick, we experience that. When we're simply weak or we're old, we experience it. And then also when we feel the grief of others, when we feel the destruction that humans have done to other humans, we do feel, I think, then the vulnerability of the kind of grief of the form that we're in. We're in a form of being.
I think I was thinking from that place versus the more personal in terms of, I think of vulnerability now as just such a profound human space, to be able to hold one's vulnerability, to be in the dignity of one's vulnerability.
Well, I think
that
if we could bring that on board in regard to power,
right?
I mean, and again, I feel like there's a lot of confusion about this idea of empowerment or self-esteem. When people want to be empowered, when they want to have a sort of, let's say, solid self-esteem, they don't seem to realize that it is based on a willingness to feel vulnerable. Because in order to do anything with others or even with yourself, to become an agent of something, you have to stick your neck out, at which moment you do not feel good.
Right.
you feel like you're afraid, or you feel like you're weak, or you feel like you know, would like to run away or to put your head back inside of your shell or whatever.
And I mean, don't you see that is also so central to when you're working in the therapeutic model, or also couples? I mean, that thing of when
the vulnerability.
When one can't touch the vulnerability, when one has to shield or protect or get away from feeling
and most
vulnerable.
of the time, the problem that I see is that for that individual who's experiencing vulnerability, it's very confusing for them, because they had the impression that now they should feel confident, now they should feel good. So, you know, I've finished all my graduate school, I'm prepared to go out there and kind of do my thing, so now I should be feeling good. And instead I'm scared, I feel weak, I feel like I might be an imposter. And my sense is, again, if people knew that that's kind of an archetype, you know, that when you're actually reaching out for this moment where you want to be an influence or you want to have an effect, that reaching out means you're sticking out your neck. And it can be, your head could be cut off, you know, metaphorically. So, of course, it's a moment of vulnerability. It's not a moment. And the more you become so-called powerful, the more influence you have, or the more you're reaching out to do new things, the more you're in contact with vulnerability. It's not like the other way around, like now vulnerability is erased and I just never feel vulnerable at all.
Or you think you have enough power so you don't have to feel vulnerable.
Yeah, and that's not possible.
Right.
That is just not possible.
That's a false front.
Yeah.
That's a persona. That's not real.
Right. And
that's a great illusion.
And power isn't something that you embody. It's an effect that you have. It's not like the queen is really powerful.
Right.
You know, we project power onto her, and she has certain effects.
Yes.
But that person in there walking around, she's a human being. She's made a lot of mistakes. She probably feels very vulnerable. You know, at any time, she's such a public figure.
Right.
You know, people could become extremely critical and rejecting of her for even small errors.
Right.
So I think that it's that issue of power and vulnerability that I wanted to clarify. But I think other aspects of vulnerability, like vulnerability in grief, or vulnerability in aging, vulnerability, you know, when you need the help of others, those are states of being that are very, very important to be able to recognize and embrace. And I think people do learn that, like you said, they can mine that vulnerability and it becomes a strength.
Or like when you're dealing with, say, I've done a lot of work around, you know, death and dying, and when, you know, you're dealing, say, with a lot of the relatives of the people close to the person who's dying, and they go to extremes not to feel, you know, to just, they can't go near the fear of death, or they can't go near, they can't, you know, and you try to help soften that, to give permission for them to feel what they're feeling, and to almost like to bless it, you know, that which is, you know, and they...
because that is a great time of vulnerability. It really is, when someone close to you has died, Yeah.
And you just watch, you can watch the behavior.
So, yeah, I mean, vulnerability is an aspect that everybody has to experience off and on in adulthood. I think the illusion of power is this idea that it's going to make vulnerability go away. But it's almost the opposite.
Right.
It's like once you get some power or authority or influence, then you're more vulnerable because you keep on getting exposed again with whatever new thing you're doing. The power and vulnerability go together, in my experience, and with people in therapy too.
Bringing up the issue, you know, of the death and dying, the thing of, you know, helping people to kind of receive the reality as it is, like, you know, the loved person is dying. It's like that kind of helping them to receive allows it to, it helps you serve them better, because they're not blocking. You know, they can be in their vulnerability, and they can just be receptive, and they can receive from another. You know, they can receive help. They can receive compassion.
Well, and that in itself then would be overall an empowering experience, because once you have experienced the vulnerability of loss, and you've been able to bear it and to get the help through it. You may feel very weakened, or you may feel very ungrounded, but then you can come out of it again. And so it's you begin to see it's bearable. It's not a...
And there's great learning in that. There's a great teaching in that.
Yeah, I think that side of being able to see and experience the weakness of life, the ordinary weakness.
Right, and it's again very, very human. Much easier, again, to kind of mine the gold there than you can when there's an absolutism around power. And you can't let the vulnerability in, and it's all masked, and you've got all those false fronts. And
well, I mean, that last thing you said, again, I think that's coming from a confusion about what power is.
Right, exactly.
Because if you have any real power, you will have to experience vulnerability, because power doesn't really exist somewhere. I mean, it's not like a human being. I thought of that as
I said that too.
Because like, the queen, for example, she's not experiencing herself as a powerful person. She may be the symbol of power, and people may project that into her, but her own experience, I'm sure, is a lot of vulnerability as she gets exposed again and again for various things that she wants.
Of course, it's awful.
It was mostly I wanted to put those two together, the power and the vulnerability, and seeing them more as going hand in hand rather than being opposites. That there's not a sort of state called empowerment when you are somehow protected from vulnerability. They're always hand in hand. So.
Okay, Polly. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, Eleanor, thank you too.
Thanks so much for listening. And to continue the conversation, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can find past episodes of the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and CastBox. Enemies from War to Wisdom is recorded and produced by Chris Coltrane.